I want you to close your eyes and picture something with me for a moment. You're in high school and it's 2050. But high school in 2050 looks different than what you thought it would be like. In this version of school, students are disinterested, heads sleeping on desks during class. This disengagement stems from the reality that students feel that the education they're learning in the classroom is woefully disconnected from what the real world actually looks like. Student activities and events have low engagement. And when there are changes in school communities, the first reaction students have is to complain about the system and do nothing about it, leaving no constructive path forward. What do you think going to school in this environment would be like? Now open your eyes. Come back to 2022. Maybe you think the situation isn't as dreary and as drastic as I described it to be. Unfortunately, I hate to start this off by being a Debbie Downer, but education is exactly how I described it to be. Education, educational institutions, and educational legislations are all made and executed with who in mind? Students. But students remain the only people without a seat at the table. Educational legislation continues to be made without the input of students, without the input of what we experience every single day when we walk through those schoolhouse doors. And I'm talking about students of all ages here, from itty-bitty elementary schoolers to middle schoolers to me, a high school junior here at Parkland. Essentially, we can go as far as to say as we're driving in the dark here. Yes, data and statistics that the state and federal government push out tell a story, but only part of the story. How can we reasonably state that data and statistics effectively communicate the softer parts of what students experience every day? The short and simple answer is that they can't. So maybe you, as a fellow student, or about students in general, are wondering what we could have to say that could just be so different than what a teacher or an administrator might be able to tell you. Well, at an organization I've co-founded, our sole mission is to gather as many of these stories as physically possible. Students for Education in Pennsylvania, or affectionately called SEPA, aims to elevate and empower students in the Pennsylvania Commonwealth in the field of education. And through our bi-monthly meetings, I've come to value and cherish these stories a lot, simply because they communicate so much that teachers and administrators might either overlook or just not put enough weightage into. One of my favorite stories to tell is about scheduling. I know, such an exciting topic. But the story is really important to me because it demonstrates how much power students can really have. For a little bit of background, during the COVID-19 pandemic, many schools had to shift learning models in order to better mitigate the spread of COVID-19. One common method of doing this was using block scheduling. At one school in particular, though, this block scheduling model continued even into the 2021-2022 school year. Now, this isn't necessarily a problem, but for students, they had a negative perspective on it. Understandably, because you're learning the same subject for up to 3 hours on end. So what did they do about it? Well, they stood up for their educational needs, priorities, and laid out a system and petitioned it. Long story short, administration understood where they were coming from and made the change back to regular scheduling models. Now, even though this story ends with a happily ever after, what I want to highlight here is that the students could have easily just complained about the system and do nothing about it. That's usually what tends to happen. But instead, they put down their grievances, actually made change, and moved forward. Because realistically, you can't really complain and argue about the system if you don't even at least try to change it. As both a student and an advocate myself, I truly feel that these collective experiences add duality to my perspective. Granted, I'm more than willing to acknowledge I'm not an expert on student psychology. I'm not even going to pretend I'm an expert on how legislation or the government works. Really, I'm not an expert on anything. But the one thing that I do know is that advocacy, and specifically advocacy for my own education, has helped me to see the world around me differently, with new perspectives, ideas, and opportunities. And the truth of the matter is that advocacy doesn't really ever stop. Sure, maybe right now I'm standing on this red dot asking you to advocate for your education. But what happens when you're not a part of the K-12 education system anymore? Advocacy doesn't turn on and off like a light switch. It continues forever. And that's what happens next. And when dominoes fall, the advocacy and the effective advocacy grows over time, as more and more people realize the power that their previously seemingly small voices actually have. So maybe all of what I'm saying here today makes sense to you. It clicks, and that's fantastic. But what I ask is that you don't treat me and this message like you treat the updates on your computer. You know exactly what I'm talking about when you click the remind me later or remind me tomorrow buttons. If we keep waiting for tomorrow, tomorrow's gonna come and go without any change. But to be honest with everyone, time is of the essence right now. As many of us involved in the field of education can attest to, this field has been transformed in the last 2 years. I don't think I need to come out explicitly and tell you why, but there's no doubt that we are at a crossroads of opportunity here. We as students have the power to have communal conversations about what worked during pandemic-era education, and more importantly, what didn't. So let's implement the good, for good, and try to solve the problems that have been plaguing education since before the pandemic ever began. To try and illustrate this, let me ask you a simple question. What do you think is the more important problem in education today? Lack of internet access or lack of devices like Chromebooks and laptops? Now, if you'd asked me this question maybe 3 months ago, I probably would have told you that I thought lack of devices was the larger issue. But the pandemic taught me and us something a little bit different than that. The issue, especially in urban areas, isn't actually lack of devices. It's lack of internet access. And that's something that a lot of schools overlooked during the pandemic. Sure, they were able to hand out devices for their students to be able to execute online learning, but these devices are rendered essentially useless when there's no internet connection to use them with. So what happened? Well, students had to sit in their cars in Walmart parking lots to get a stable enough Wi-Fi connection to complete their homework. Take a minute to let that sink in. Just like the scheduling story I mentioned earlier, these are things that students are uniquely experiencing as a part of their educational experience. And improving and building upon these things can only really be done if students rise up and share them. This is even more important in the context of lessons that we learned during COVID-era education. Another indisputable fact is that COVID has probably changed maybe more than just how we get our education. It's changed what happens at the end of the school day, when the last bell rings. I'm not just talking about extracurricular activities. I'm talking about how school communities function within themselves and how they function with their outer communities as a result. And that's where us students come into play one more time. The very first step of advocating for your education is becoming reinvested in it, re-involved in your school's academics, athletics, and arts programs. Because realistically, how are you supposed to tell what's going wrong with the system if you're standing outside of it, outside of the glass box, and simply looking in? How are you supposed to tell that your vision isn't being obscured or manipulated by something other than just a glass box? Now, this trend of deteriorating engagement is something that the students in SEPA have noticed as well. Club attendance is down across the board. Less students are involved in activities and events. So please, reinvest in your education. Start the journey of advocacy and jump right in. And please, please, please don't wait until tomorrow. As Catherine Calvin of the United Nations states, young people aren't the leaders of tomorrow. They're the leaders of today and tomorrow. So often, young people are told to just wait after high school, wait after college, wait after you're all settled down to start advocating for causes that are important to you. But starting now and starting soon requires you to believe that your voice has a lot more power than you give it credit for. Trust me, it's easy to believe your voice doesn't have power. Mathematically, it seems to not, in a world where we have 7 billion people vying for attention and a voice. But if we look at things from a more functional, societal perspective, every voice has power to make change, all on its own. In the same breath, though, even though your voice has power all on its own, there's immense power in asking for help and even collaborating. So much of what we do as students, and even once we become adults, is self-confined. The thought process of, oh, I'll just share this when it's all perfect and ready to go and buttoned up. I did the same thing when starting this talk. But it's scary to share something new that's not entirely perfect yet, whether that's thoughts, actions, words, or ideas. But to be honest, advocacy, and especially advocacy for your education, is best done in groups and little coalitions of like-minded students working towards the same goals. Notice that when I introduced SEPA, I said co-founder. It's not a one-woman show. Nothing really ever is. And keep in mind, SEPA is just about Pennsylvania. If we have a larger perspective, maybe across the entire United States of America, how many more collaborators do you think we would need? 20, right? Okay, maybe 30. To be safe, 40. No more than that. Well, the exact answer is 79. I know, oddly specific, but that's the number of students in the National Student Board Members Association, or NSBMA. This is an up-and-coming organization that aims to help students represent other students in school board member positions through advocacy workshops and trainings. This is a perfect example of the coalition I just referenced. This is a group of students united by their common desire to help students represent students to the best of their ability, along with a larger student perspective, while also creating more student board member positions across the country. Now, that lofty of a goal could never be achieved by just one student. That's why there are 78 more of them. So to recap, what have we talked about so far? Re-engaging, today versus tomorrow, and collaboration. Great. But where do I start with this advocacy stuff anyway? Where's the start line? Honestly, anywhere you want it to be. Advocacy takes many shapes and forms, but if we're looking for a great place to start, relevant specifically to education, I would recommend school board meetings or general policy meetings. Most school board meetings are open to the general public, and so are those in the state government. Although I serve as a junior representative to the Pennsylvania State Board of Education and attend every board meeting that we have, every board meeting is also live streamed to the general public. And at every board meeting, at the very end, our chair asks for public comment. See where I'm going with this? So, students, the path forward is ours and ours alone for the taking. And to all the adults in the room, I hope I've shown you the power that student voice can have and will have on not mine, not yours, but our collective futures. When I started this talk, I showed you what education would look like in 2050. And then I also showed you that that's what actually education looks like today. Which leads me to the ideal scenario. Let's try this one more time. Close your eyes and picture something with me for a moment. You're in high school and it's 2050. But high school in 2050 looks different than what you thought it would be like. There's a student board member at every single school board meeting. This student board member provides a student perspective, but also has an advisory group made up of other students in order to help them provide a more diverse student perspective. Students are engaged in the classroom, excited to learn, and helping their students and teachers supplement their education with information about the world around them that they want to learn. Activities and events after school are teeming with involvement and engagement, and students are excited to be there. But when you walk out of high school on your very last day, the day you graduate, your love for advocacy doesn't change. Only the purpose does. Thank you.